In the heart of medieval Europe, a young princess was born into a world shaped by power, ambition, and fragile alliances. She was Isabella of Valois, a child destined to become the Queen of England at an age when most children still played with toys. Her story begins not with triumph, but with the weight of political necessity. Isabella was the daughter of King Charles VI of France, remembered by history as Charles the Mad, and Queen Isabella of Bavaria, born in 1389. She entered a kingdom torn apart by internal strife, and the long-running Hundred Years' War between England and France. In the moment of her birth, Isabella was a symbol of fragile hope for peace between two bitter enemies. England under King Richard II was weary of endless conflict. The war had drained resources, broken families, and filled the land with despair. Richard sought not only to secure his throne, but also to ease the suffering of his kingdom. He believed that peace with France could be achieved not by the sword, but through marriage. In 1396, negotiations began between the two crowns. Richard, then 29 years old, and Isabella, only 6, became the central figures in a grand diplomatic arrangement. This union was meant to silence the drums of war. At least for a time, a fragile truce was signed, and Isabella was promised to the English king. The marriage shocked many across Europe. Critics whispered that a child bride could not possibly bring stability, while others argued that such alliances had long been the tools of diplomacy. For Richard, it was not a matter of romance, but a survival. For France, it was a chance to protect their young princess, while easing the tension of war. When Isabella was brought to England, she arrived with all the ceremony and splendor one could imagine. Yet beneath the jeweled silks and cheering crowds there remained a reality that she was still only a child. The English people looked upon her with curiosity and mixed feelings. Some welcomed her as a symbol of peace, while others distrusted the French alliance. Despite her age, Isabella quickly adapted to her new life in England. She was cared for by a royal household that sought to raise her as befitting a queen. Though Richard treated her more like a daughter than a wife, he would dine with her, converse with her, and ensure she was educated in the customs of the English court. But their relationship remained distant and ceremonial. Richard saw Isabella as the embodiment of a truce between two nations, and he worked hard to honor the peace that her presence symbolized. Yet beneath the surface, discontent brewed. Richard's reign was marked by tension with the English nobility, who resented his methods of rule. His reliance on diplomacy rather than war was seen by many as weakness, and whispers of rebellion began to stir. For Isabella, these early years in England were quiet, but not without strain. She missed her family, her homeland, and the warmth of her mother. Queen Isabel letters and gifts would occasionally travel across the channel, but the young girl often found herself lonely within the cold stone walls of the English court. Her childhood had been traded for politics, and she bore the weight with grace far beyond her years. In 1399, Richard embarked on a campaign in Ireland, leaving the realm vulnerable. In his absence, Henry Bolingbroke seized the moment. Returning from exile, he raised support among the nobles and common people alike. Within weeks, Richard's power crumbled, and the crown slipped from his grasp. Isabella watched in the shadows as her world was torn apart. When Richard was captured and forced to abdicate the throne, Isabella's position became precarious. She was still a child, yet she was also the queen of a deposed monarch. Her very presence was a reminder of the broken peace between England and France. The court around her shifted alliances and whispered of her uncertain future. Richard was imprisoned and soon after mysteriously died in captivity. The official story claimed it was natural causes, yet many believed he was murdered to secure Henry's hold on the throne. Isabella, though too young to fully understand the complexities of power, knew one thing with certainty: the man she had been married to, the king who had been her guardian and protector, was gone. Her grief was compounded by fear. Henry IV, now on the throne, had little interest in honoring the marriage alliance that Richard had forged for him. Isabella was a political inconvenience, a reminder of a treaty he no longer wished to uphold. Yet despite his efforts, she refused to renounce her title as Queen of England. Even at such a tender age, Isabella displayed remarkable resilience, holding firm to the dignity her role demanded. As tensions reignited between England and France, her future became a matter of fierce debate. The English crown considered marrying her to Henry's son to solidify legitimacy, but Isabella steadfastly resisted. She declared openly that she would not marry the son of the man who had dethroned and destroyed her husband. This defiance earned her quiet admiration both in France and among those in England who still held loyalty to Richard's memory. At last, after years of negotiation, Isabella was allowed to return home to France. She departed England with a heavy heart, leaving behind not only the crown, but also a chapter of her life defined by sorrow and loss. She returned not as the triumphant Queen of England, but as a young widow carrying scars that would never truly heal. Yet this was only the beginning of Isabella's story. Her return to France would set the stage for new challenges, alliances, and tragedies that awaited her in the years that followed. She would once again find herself entangled in the dangerous web of dynastic politics, a pawn on the chessboard of kings. And Queen's her tale, a blend of innocence, resilience, and heartbreak, reminds us of the human cost hidden within the grand stage of history. After years of uncertainty, Isabella of Valois finally returned to her homeland, France. She was still only 11 years old, yet she carried the weight of a widow's sorrow. Her brief life as Queen of England had ended with betrayal, loss, and humiliation. Her father, Charles VI, welcomed her back with kindness, but her return was overshadowed by the same chaos that had long haunted France. The kingdom was fractured by civil war, rival factions, and the unending shadow of conflict with England. For Isabella, the French court was both a comfort and a prison. She was surrounded by family, yet constantly reminded of her political value to many nobles. She was not a child, but a royal pawn, a symbol that could be used to secure alliances, strengthen claims, and manipulate rival powers. Still, Isabella longed for peace and stability. She had endured the cold halls of England and the death of Richard II. Now she wished for nothing more than a life of safety and dignity. By her teenage years, negotiations began for a second marriage. This time the suitor was Charles, Duke of Orléans, cousin to the French king. Unlike her first marriage, this was not a union of desperate politics, but one born with measure hope. Charles was closer in age, refined, and well respected in the royal family. Their marriage in 1406 was celebrated with grandeur, filling the people of France with cautious optimism for her. Isabella, it seemed a chance at last to reclaim the joys of youth that had been stolen from her. In her second marriage, Isabella found moments of genuine happiness. Charles treated her with affection and respect. Their bond was far more personal than the distant relationship she had endured with Richard II. Together, they dreamed of building a family and strengthening the Orleans branch of the royal house. It was the first time Isabella experienced life, not just as a pawn of politics, but as a woman loved and cherished. Yet fate once again proved unkind. The political climate of France remained unstable. The rivalry between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions tore the kingdom apart. Violence, corruption, and betrayal became the order of the day. While Isabella sought to protect her new household, the forces of war crept closer to her doors. The fragile peace she hoped for dissolved into fear and uncertainty. Her health began to fail as the weight of loss and political pressure pressed upon her. In 1409, at only 19 years old, Isabella died, leaving behind a grief-stricken Charles and a court shocked by the cruelty of fate. Some chroniclers suggested illness, others whispered a heartbreak. Whatever the cause, her life was cut tragically short. Her story did not end with her death. The memory of Isabella of Valois lingered in both England and France to the French. She was a daughter of a troubled king and the young duchess whose life was stolen too soon to the English. She remained the child queen whose brief presence had symbolized a fleeting hope for peace between two nations locked in endless war. Isabella had been more than a princess. She had been a fragile bridge, a reminder of what might have been. Though her years were few, Isabella's journey from France to England and back again revealed the harsh realities faced by royal women of the Middle Ages, born into power, yet stripped of freedom. They carried the burdens of diplomacy and war upon their shoulders. Isabella's dignity, her courage, and her quiet defiance ensured that she was remembered not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience. Her tale is one of innocence, loss of love briefly found, and of destiny cruelly denied. Even centuries later, the echo of her life continues to remind us of the price of power and the fragility of peace. Isabella of Valois returned to France, carrying the sorrow of her first marriage and the fragile hopes of her second, though her union with Charles, Duke of Orléans, brought moments of happiness. It was destined to be brief. Her death, at only 19, left behind a trail of grief and unfulfilled promise. Her story could have ended there, a sad tale of another young queen consumed by the cruelties of history. But Isabella's legacy did not vanish so easily. In France, she was mourned as more than a duchess. She was remembered as the daughter of Charles VI, whose reign had been haunted by madness and civil strife. Her gentle spirit and quiet resilience became symbols of endurance for a nation longing for stability. Chroniclers described her as beautiful, pious, and dignified, a young woman who had suffered greatly, yet carried her burdens with grace. Her death left Charles of Orléans devastated. He was captured in battle only a few years later and spent decades in English captivity. During those long years, he wrote poetry filled with longing, sorrow, and the memory of Isabella. Her presence lingered as verses, like a ghost haunting the corridors of his heart. Through his words, Isabella lived on not only as a figure of political history, but as a muse of personal grief and love. In England, Isabella's memory was more complicated to some. She was a tragic child queen who had been used as a tool of diplomacy to others. She was a reminder of Richard II, the deposed monarch, whose fall had reshaped the kingdom. Her refusal to marry Henry IV's son remained a quiet act of defiance, admired even by those who opposed her French heritage. She had shown that even a child could resist the crushing weight of politics and hold true to loyalty and dignity. As the 100 Years' War rage on Isabella's brief life became part of a much larger story, the conflict between England and France continued for decades, consuming generations of soldiers and citizens, yet the fragile truce she had once symbolized remained a reminder that peace, even when fleeting, was possible. Her marriage to Richard II had not ended the war, but it had shown the world that even in the darkest times there was hope for reconciliation. Centuries later, historians still reflect on Isabella's life not only for its political significance, but for its human dimension. She was a child forced into the role of queen or widow before she was a woman, and a duchess whose happiness was stolen too soon. Her experiences revealed the stark realities of medieval royalty, where daughters were bargaining chips and personal freedom was a luxury rarely afforded. Yet Isabella was not merely a victim. Her resilience, her dignity, and her refusal to bend completely to political pressure make her story one of quiet strength. She endured what few could have borne, and in her short years, she left an imprint on both kingdoms. Her life, though brief, was a testament to courage in the face of unimaginable trials. Isabella of Valois may not have changed the course of nations, but she touched the lives of those around her and left a memory that endured beyond her years. Her tale is a reminder that history is not only shaped by kings, generals, and wars, but also by young women whose lives reveal the human cost of power and ambition. Her story closes not with victory, but with remembrance, and perhaps in remembrance there is a victory of another kind. Isabella's life, cut short at 19, still speaks across the centuries. It tells us of innocence lost to fleeting peace, and of a young queen who carried herself with grace in a world that gave her none.